all the people on the earth, God chose Abraham to bless. God promised Abraham that one day he would have a child and that eventually he would have as many children as there were stars in the sky. God promised to give those children a special land for their very own. God promised to give them a king and to make them a great nation that would bless all the other nations. And best of all, God promised that he would have a relationship with his people. He would be Abraham's God and the God of all his descendants forever. Blessing upon blessing upon blessing. God is so good. Abraham had a son named Isaac, who had a son named Jacob, who had 12 sons, and all of God's promises were passed on to them. When there was famine in the land of Canaan, Jacob's whole family moved to Egypt, where they were blessed by God. In Egypt they grew in numbers until there were not 100 or 1,000 of them, but more than 1,000,000 of them. There were so many of them that they filled the land of Egypt. And from time on they were called the Israelites, God's chosen people, chosen to be a blessing to the whole world. In Egypt things were good for God's people, but after 400 years a new king came into power. Actually, in Egypt the king is not called the king, he is called the Pharaoh. So anyway, this new Pharaoh came into power. But he didn't know anything about God or his chosen people. He saw the Israelites growing in number and he became afraid of them. He was very cruel to them and made them his slaves. God's people hated being slaves. They were sad and scared and they cried out to God, "Help! Help us! Rescue us! Please!" God, who is loving and good, heard their cries, and God answered their prayer. God sent signs to show Pharaoh what a big, strong, mighty, powerful God he was. He sent 10 great signs. You can count them out with me on your fingers. He turned the Nile River to blood. He made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping. He sent gnats and flies and sickness and a rash called boils that covered the bodies of the Egyptians. He sent huge hailstones and a storm of locusts. He sent darkness when it should have been day. And still Pharaoh would not let his people go. So God sent one more sign, and all of the oldest sons in every house died. Even Pharaoh's son died. But God kept all of his children, all those who knew him and obeyed him, safe. None of God's children died that day. And so finally, Pharaoh said, "Leave, go." God's people were free. God had done it. He had rescued his people from slavery. Thousands and thousands and thousands of God's people left Egypt at once. When the people came to the Red Sea, God parted the waters, and the people walked right across on dry land all the way to freedom. God led his people deep into the desert, showing them the way to go with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. With each and every step they took, the people realized they had to trust God and to follow his lead. In the desert, God provided for his people. He gave them manna by day and quail by night. He even brought water from the rocks just so they could have something to drink. With each bite of food and each sip of water, God's people realized they had to depend on God for all they needed. In the desert, God's people were getting to know God. They were learning all about Him, His goodness, His love, and His holiness. And they were learning how to be in relationship with Him.